Allez, tu dois. I have to say, this car boot is surprisingly roomy. Welcome to Monstrosities Mon Amour, where people love the things you loathe. Thanks for joining me. I'll just budge up a bit. Today I've been kidnapped by architecture botherer, heritage trail walker, and Instagram good guy, Philip Downer. He's chucked me in the boot of his Austin Maxi and driven me to a secret location. Thankfully, I've made my escape with a hat pin and a lot of stalk margarine. Philip, what the hell's going on?
Well, I've brought you to the City of London, so I'm going to have to remember to pay my congestion charge later. And we are on East Cheap, running east towards the Tower of London, and we're outside Minster Court, which is this huge, magnificent, spiky, postmodernist office block, which is scheduled to be substantially demolished, reconfigured, and going to lose an awful lot of its charm.
Now, charm is an interesting word here. Absolutely bonkers building. I mean, look at it. Great big arches and colonnades leading up to huge, great spiky protuberances on the top. It's super gothic, but in a really Tim Burton, Gotham, Batman way. It's quite remarkable. Why do you like it?
Well, I think you just explained. I mean, what's not to love about it? It's peak developers' postmodernism. So much of that is being erased now, particularly in the city where they're always looking for the new thing. We've had a number of Pomo blocks that are just get neutered one by one. There's Salisbury Square south of Fleet Street, 20 Old Bailey. I mean, you can guess where that might be. That was a splendid sort of postmodern festival of columns and fenestration and things. And it's just been turned into a bland white box. And you think, well, while they were there, why didn't they do the Old Bailey as well? It's a loss of joie de vivre. Minster Court still has that, but that doesn't seem to be acceptable in the 2020s.
No, well, there's certainly nothing bland about Minster Court, is there? It's quite an extraordinary thing. It's 3 buildings, really, isn't it?
2 of them are going to be redeveloped, and one of them, for the time being, is going to stay, but nothing's listed. I'm not keeping my hopes up.
One of the things I really like about it is that the crazy roofline, you spot it from all over different places, don't you, including the other side of the Thames. It kind of pops up, which is kind of remarkable that it's got this presence where it's surrounded by all of these slightly bland steel and glass boxes, and then sort of among them you've got this extraordinary extravaganza.
That's right, yes, and it's as if the city is saying, oh, this is a bit edgy, this is a bit too much. We need to bland this down so it matches everything else. And I do find that a little bit depressing.
It's almost like a plated dinosaur in that, you've got this staggered roofline which keeps ascending like a kind of crescendo that never ends. It sort of goes on and on, doesn't it? Keeps going up.
Yes, I mean, I think if Alfred Waterhouse had been doing office blocks in the 1980s, then this might be what we'd end up with. It reminds me of the Prudential offices in Holborn, or the Cruciform at UCL in Gower Street, which is completely mad. And I imagine that's avoided demolition a few times in its life and has somehow survived. But we need these buildings to give the city its character. This is not Dubai.
And one of the things I think is really interesting is that Gollins, Melvin and Ward, who were the architects, they were set up immediately post-war. They designed a number of very Mies van der Rohe style towers in London, including one of the first, Castrol House. They all retired. The Gollins, Melvin and Ward all retired in 1974. So we get to the 80s. We sort of I imagine that when they were hired by by the developer to build something on this site, they might not have been expecting them to have come up with something like this? Or do you think it was, because I'm not 100% sure whether it was a competition or whether it was something that they were actually asked to do. But it's not something that you would ever have expected this particular practice to have come up with. In fact, it's the complete antithesis of everything that they'd stood for in that post-war period. And so as a building sort of come out of nowhere, not only does it feel like it slightly comes out of nowhere when you're walking down the street, but it feels like it must have come slightly out of nowhere at the time.
It does, doesn't it? And It's interesting because you'd got a lot of established architectural practices who were having a go at Pomo at this time. I have no idea whether there was a competition or whether there was a CEO of the developers wanted a Pomo landmark building, or the city thought that it would be fun, because the city was certainly looking for more interesting profiles back then. But that's what they were able to produce. That's what Gollins, Melvin and Ward knocked up for us, and we're just very lucky. So what are we doing 40 years later? We want to knock it all down.
While it's still there, it's definitely worth celebrating, isn't it? And worth kind of walking around. And actually, because it has got little courtyard space that you can go into with the amazing like horse sculptures.
That's right, yes. You know what the horses are called?
Yeah, aren't they named after money?
Yes, they're called dollar, yen and sterling.
Incredible.
Just the city reminding you of what matters there.
Exactly. And also it's a reminder, this building started in 1987, and that just feels like the most 1987 gesture possible.
Absolutely.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can feel Nigel Lawson rolling around on the floor in delight at that.
Oh, boy. Yes, absolutely.
It crops up in stuff, including Cruella de Vil's offices in a live-action version of 101 Dalmatians.
Yeah.
And it feels like it was absolutely destined for that, doesn't it?
Oh, it's completely perfect for that. The fact that this building actually exists, that we have this CGI apparition of a building existing in pink marble and steel in the middle of the City of London is something to celebrate rather than something to try and erase.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting because Gollins, Melvin and Ward back in the 70s were one of the pioneers of computer-aided design at that point where hardly anybody was able to either be able to do that or actually afford it if anyone was developing it. So they pioneered that. And looking at this building, it's hard to imagine that it was possible without a lot of computer-aided design, because even though it's using a lot of Gothic tropes in the way that it's massed and the way that the detailing of it, the size of it, the sort of immense scope of that building, and the fact it was put up so quickly, really, in just about 4 years. I imagine that computer-aided design would have been really central to that building. So that idea of it being a CGI apparition, I think, feels exactly right. There's a kind of cleanness to it as well, isn't there, which is peculiarly at odds with its Gothic nature.
It's very slick, isn't it? It's got that sort of Gotham Batman feel to it, that this is the sort of building that supervillains will create as their lairs. And it's a splendid thing. I should be very sorry to lose most of it.
One of the interesting things that's happened, I think, recently is there's been a bit of an outcry about this from a lot of people. And yet I imagine if we went back in time sort of 10, 15 years, I bet hardly anybody would have a good word to say about this building. It was one of those buildings that was derided at the time. It was Monster Court and whatever for ages. And now people are sort of realising that buildings that have got an enormous amount of character and personality like this, they make a place. And in somewhere like the city, which is so mutable, it's changing all the time, having a building like that with so much character and then losing it is a real tragedy for having a sense of place within the City of London.
Well, it is, and it sort of speaks to our failure to understand what postmodernism was about, looking at it and thinking, oh, this is Toy Town nonsense, rather than something that, as you say, does create a sense of place, stands out as somewhere different, has got a skyline that's recognisable from all sorts of different angles. You know where you are. There's an architectural clarity to it, which I think is, it seems a curious thing to say about such an extraordinary fussy building, but it's doing what it wants to do as best it can.
Do you remember when you first encountered it?
Well, funnily enough, I remember going to huge corporate Christmas parties in a banqueting suite of the building that predated it. And so the ghost of terrible goings-on from my 1980s is embedded in its foundations. I was living out in Surrey Docks at the time, working for Our Price Records, driving everywhere, and so I would be regularly going past Minster Court and indeed making detours to go past Minster Court, which of course looks fantastic after dark as well. It's
interesting that you mentioned Surrey Quays there, because I guess one of the things, if anybody's followed your Instagram account will know, is that you are obsessed with Docklands architecture. And And particularly those 1980s and early 90s outpourings of Pomo Docklands.
Yes, absolutely.
And where's that come from? Where's his interest come from?
Well, it's partly because I bought one of them when it was new and lived in it and watched Rotherhithe being transformed around me. And I was up on the third floor of a Barrett development. And so I through one of the set of windows, I could see across the Rotherhithe Peninsula towards the shopping centre and the big Tesco. And in the other direction, I could watch Canary Wharf being built, which was pretty impressive because I think that the tower was going up at a rate of about 4 stories a fortnight. So you'd turn away and you'd find that it had changed again. So it always fascinated me. It was very exciting to be living in somewhere that was being created around you. And yet was so close to the centre of London and was so much part of the heart of London and the history of London. So it's remained a keen interest ever since.
Yeah, there is something fascinating about that contrast, isn't there? Which, again, with Minster Court, it's like fake oldie-worldy next to buildings that are actually incredibly old, going back many centuries.
There's some very good Victorian stuff on Eastcheap, and so it works very well with it.
We should mention it's also on Mincing Lane, which is definitely one of my favourite roads in London. Interesting that, you were living in an environment that was being completely rebuilt at that time. And what was it like to actually be in the middle of all of that building work? Because, you would have been there at the very early days of like the DLR and all that stuff.
That's right, although, of course, the DLR never came to Surrey Docks.
No.
And what was interesting was that with each new development, you felt that they were sort of pushing the envelope a bit further. My block was built by Barrett, so they were playing it safe. They were sticking on some Pomo flourishes, and all the window frames were a sort of malachite green. So that was all rather splendid, and we got all the appropriate pointy bits and balls on columns and things that are mandatory parts of the developer's playbook. Across a little canal, we'd got CZWG building Wolf Crescent, which really is extraordinary and always well worth a visit. And then across the river, you could see 5 Cabot Place, the vast office block that I think was filled with admen, but was styled like a 1880s New York office block. And quite extraordinary, huge arcades at ground level, huge amount of detail in the cladding, because of course it's cladding, none of it's structural. But my favourite story about that one was that they took Mrs. Thatcher down to Docklands with Olympia and York so that she could talk about the importance of private enterprise and so on and so forth. And she assumed 5 Cabot Place was an original dockside building and wasn't new at all. I don't believe Margaret Thatcher was ever known for her architectural appreciation, but it's interesting that she got that one so wrong.
But also the architects would have been absolutely delighted, wouldn't they? You imagine how thrilled they would have been at that point, doing that sort of grand gesture impersonation. That building is particularly kind of outrageous, isn't it? It's got so much detailing on it. It's almost in a way the opposite of Minster Court, where the profile and the kind of the sculptural nature of it does all of that work. On that building, it's all micro, kind of everything is covered with some extraordinary detail or reference to somewhere else. You're sort of in Vienna here, and you're in the Middle East here, or whatever. It's very interesting that building is so detailed. So, and it's a kind of reminder that even though people were designing buildings at the same time, roughly from the same impulse, the way that they tackled that impulse, the way that they tackled that problem would be completely different and at odds with one another. It didn't produce identikit buildings, did it?
I think that's the exciting thing about Phase 1 Canary Wharf. The buildings weren't built to match. They were all built as standalone and very individual from each other. So you've got one that's clad in white marble, and you've got another one that looks like a big Victorian warehouse, and you've got all these varieties. You've got a slick modernist one hidden behind the big train shed over the DLR. All sorts of different approaches, and there was a sense that they were actually having fun with it, and that they were creating somewhere that was deliberately different. Whereas you go to Canary Wharf now, And there's a sense that it's sort of don't scare the horses. Don't worry. This does look like everywhere else in the world, and so it's perfectly safe. Be our guest and buy one of our $3 million apartments.
Well, one of the things I really like about the way that you approach your appreciation of this stuff, via your Instagram account and talking to you, obviously, is that you're not just interested in what all the big names were doing or all the big famous buildings and those landmarks that we all know.
Yeah.
Actually, in some ways, the most fun seems to come from unearthing the minor curiosities rather than the great big landmarks.
I do like the demotic stuff, and I do avoid doing, the Houses of Parliament or something like that, because it just feels too obvious and I don't know what I can add to it. But also, it's interesting, you look at what the public loves. A lot of what they love is the small stuff. So it's the 1934 white box houses or the little brutalist libraries. It's these sort of little jewels that are planted in high streets and suburbs throughout the country. They're easier to love than the vast pieces of brutalism, whatever the style might have been, that people will still call brutalist monstrosities and things like that. They're more comfortable with the small stuff, and I like the small stuff.
I used to work for Waterstones, and I used to work briefly at Waterstones head office, which was out in Brentford on a business park. And our Price's office was identical and was next door.
It was, yes.
I was just wondering, did you used to go there? Because that was another one of that era's buildings, wasn't it? A kind of big ranch style.
Yeah, ranch style with the big porticos. And I worked in that building for a couple of years. And I can report to you that your building has been knocked down and my building is still there.
Oh, shut up. Honestly, it's outrageous, isn't it?
There's more towers of apartments going in around there, sort of flanking the M4 viaduct. But for some reason, the Our Price building survived and is now a private school.
Is it?
Yes.
There we are. One thing you mentioned earlier was your apartment block having its green window frames. And that is a really, really characteristic thing of a lot of that early phase of Docklands stuff, isn't it? The Docklands Development Corporation era architecture is really characterised by a lot of this brightly coloured, slightly graphic design, almost rather than architectural.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's a relationship between that architecture and sort of album covers of the early 1980s, that sort of thing. We had green window frames and the people across the road had red window frames. You could almost give people directions according to the details that had been stuck onto the outside of their boxes. It all added a bit of fun at a relatively low cost. And it's sad to go back there today and see that for perfectly understandable reasons, the windows have reached the end of their life, but they're all being replaced with the same white factory-made stuff, and the buildings lose a lot of their charm as a result of it.
I wonder whether, having lived there,
lived the dream.
Exactly, when you live the dream. When you go to somewhere like the city down the river and you encounter a building like Minster Court, is that catching your eye because it feels familiar? It feels part of that landscape. It feels part of the Docklands landscape more than it does really the city.
It certainly feels like an outlier for the city because so much of the money was going into Canary Wharf at the time and the city didn't really know how to respond. And they hadn't reached the point that they arrived at 10 years later, which was let's build lots of tall towers and cluster them all together. So that again made Minster Court stand out. It was unusual. I think the only other comparable area would have been the whole Broadgate development, much of which, of course, had been subsequently knocked down.
The city wasn't really doing a lot of these great big projects then, in a way that now we just think it's entirely synonymous with that, don't we? We assume that the city is always going to be building enormous things, and therefore nowhere is safe, from that, including
That's right.
Minster Court itself. But Docklands as well, I'm sort of amazed by how quickly those original Docklands buildings from the 80s and 90s now feel quite old. They've been made to feel old by the sheer amount of new buildings going up all the time. But these buildings aren't even that old. It's interesting that even the tallest buildings have been overshadowed by even taller new buildings. There's a real rush to build new in Docklands that hasn't really stopped, has it?
No, that's right. And I remember seeing cascades being built. on the far side of the river, you were thinking all the time, are they really going to sell all those flats? Are they really going to persuade that number of people to go and live in that location on the Isle of Dogs? It felt like an extraordinary gamble at the time. And you look across the river now at Cascades, and it's this little pimple on the riverfront. And and there's a few dozen flats in there or something. But as you say, the scale has changed extraordinarily.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was sort of amazed by Cascades, weren't they, at the time, that it could even exist. I mean,
that's right, yes.
And also it seemed immense. I mean, I remember looking at it and kind of thinking, wow, that is huge, great big wedge. It's outrageous looking. And now it seems like one of the most sensible little historic buildings in the area.
It's a sweet little thing now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Much of what I enjoy looking at, no architect will own up to now, because these buildings went up before architects had their websites, before records were being kept of who was building everything. So it's often quite difficult to find out the names of the guilty parties. I don't know how easy it would be for us to find out who designed the offices for our Price and Waterstones. Probably almost impossible unless we went through all the files that they've got at Hounslow Council.
Honouring some of those buildings that haven't got those names attached to them is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's quite often those buildings that, as you say, people might really like them, but they're also the ones that maybe, because they don't have that association, they're not going to necessarily last forever.
No, that's right. You know, if you weren't designed by Terry Farrell, then immediately you're going to start dropping down the list, and Historic England is going to be less interested in you, and so on and so forth. There's an office block on the Chiswick High Road called Blenheim House, which is a superb name for an office block. It's obviously got nothing to do with the Duke of Marlborough. And it sort of stands in for thousands of similar office blocks across the country. And it's got the portico, and it's got the wild fenestration, and it's got the chrome plate and the balconies and the abutments that architecturally aren't really doing anything. I've featured it once or twice on Instagram, simply as an example of something that nobody pays a blind bit of notice to, and it could disappear tomorrow. And I do think that one's children's children, in however many years' time, will be coming back and say, well, I can't believe you let them do that to Minster Court. I can't believe that you allowed them to knock down Angel House in Islington and replace it with a glass box. How was this ever allowed to happen? But of course, nobody says that today, apart from me. Postmodernism is still the style that it's okay to hate. You know, joyous, fun-coloured, life-enhancing are the qualities that we're not looking for at the moment, whereas I look at the world today and I think joyous, colourful and life-enhancing is exactly what we do need. And we ought to be celebrating that. They're at that sort of 40 years old point at which buildings are at their lowest ebb. All the shine has rubbed off, but they're still far too young for anybody to feel nostalgic about them or to appreciate their unique qualities. And so consequently, they all get lost. And we've just seen this happening again and again over time. 100 years ago, we were gaily demolishing the very best of Georgian London, Bank of England and Regent Street and the Adelphi, and, you know, they all went. We'll be doing the same with Pomo and everything else for a long time to come, I fear.
Climate crisis or not, that still seems to be completely acceptable, doesn't it, to do that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's embodied carbon. What's that?
Now, earlier on when I was trapped in the boot, I could hear what I thought sounded like a cat being throttled by Phil Spector. I realised after a while that actually you were playing on the cassette player Sugar Baby Love by the Rubettes on repeat. What happened there?
Well, it's a great record. It certainly bears listening 2 or 3 times in a row. It's certainly the Rubettes' greatest hit. The only thing that anybody probably remembers about the Rubettes now. It's a bit like Pomo. It's something that went out of fashion and never came back again. I guess during the 1970s, you'd got geniuses knocking out an album or 2 a year, sort of David Bowie or Joni Mitchell or Marvin Gaye or whoever it might have been. And then you've got all these journeymen stomping around the gig circuit, like Budgie or Barclay James Harvest. You know, from time to time, journeymen would become stars like Slade. But then you've got the remnants of old Tin Pan Alley still manufacturing records. And I've always liked Tin Pan Alley. I've always liked the Brill Building. And this, you mentioned Phil Spector. This is a successor to all of that. And it has this sort of airless perfection. And if you don't like airless perfection, if you like to be able to hear people's fingers squeaking on the strings, then that's probably not for you. But it's a broad church, and it's got a lovely structure to it. It's like a 3-act movie. There's the setup, there's the disruption, and then there's the resolution. So you have the bit in the middle. People, take my advice. If you love someone, don't think twice. Oh, that's a splendid motto for life. And then you have that amazing falsetto. And they had this huge hit all over Europe, but they didn't have a band because it had just been knocked up in the studio and someone had invented the name Rubettes in the lunch break or something like that. No one knew this thing was going to be so big, so they had to invent a band. But the man who provided the voice, the falsetto, Paul da Vinci, didn't want to be in the band. So the Rubettes' career was on a gentle slide after that because they could never actually reproduce the quality of their first hit. It's like Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons without Frankie Valli.
It is such an extraordinary production. You listen to it and it's sort of overwhelmingly enormous and it never stops. It's relentless and it seems to kind of grow all the time as you're going, as it goes through. And the falsetto itself is absolutely astonishing. I mean, it sort of knocks your head off.
It does.
I can't quite believe what you're listening to.
It merits appreciation. I mean, if Sugar Baby Love was a building, it wouldn't be St Paul's or the Shard or something. It's that house on the corner that's a bit different and it's got a turret or some stained glass or something, and it always cheers you up when you go past and you think, yeah, I'm glad that's around. I'm not claiming that Sugar Baby Love is high art, but I do think it's life-enhancing. And I think that if you're missing that, then you are missing out on something.
Definitely. I do think if it was a building, it would probably have a water slide going around the outside of it as well.
Sounds all right to me. Yep.
It is a sort of non-stop thrill of a song, isn't it? Just when you think it's reached its kind of peak, as you say, it's in kind of like 3 acts, you sort of think, oh, it's done that thing perfectly. And then it does something else. And then it does something else. And you're like, oh. Yeah. And then you're sort of like overwhelmed by the end of it. Their performances as well, considering, as you say, they weren't a real band performing this song on Top of the Pops or whatever. They're doing dance routines. They've got 2 pianos. They're all in berets. It's all very kind of like stylized and slightly ridiculous. And there's no attempt to look realistic. And
they didn't have the authenticity of Mud or Shawaddy Waddy. So,
I mean, they couldn't possibly reach that level of grit. That era, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because there was so much looking back to, as you say, Brill Building and doo-wop and all these kind of great sort of American songwriting styles. It has all these nods to slightly different things going on.
Yes.
And then this huge maximalist production that sort of makes the Ronettes sound like Tracy Chapman. It's sort of so full on and extraordinary. But it's quite funny that, you as somebody that's worked in music for a long time, this would be exactly the kind of song, I imagine, that it would be quite difficult to bring up as a song that you liked to other people in that world.
I think the world of music was a broad church. We all understood that there were things that we liked that were, guilty pleasures, horrible phrase.
I'm sorry, you're now banned.
Yes, okay. It's been lovely talking to you. It evokes, when you were younger, when you were growing up. And so, we all have songs that come from that sort of particular point. I mean, I would have been, 13 when it came out. So you're very impressionable. And you don't exactly know the history of rock and roll at that point. And so you just think, this is a great record, isn't it? I shall buy this single and I shall put it next to my Beatles albums or something like that.
And it also, whenever I hear it, it reminds me of that amazing auteur song, The Rubettes, which is sort of based on this, which is all about, it's an amazing kind of coming-of-age song.
That's right.
You talking about being 13, it kind of captures a real moment in time. There's probably like quite a narrow band of people that were hugely, hugely affected by that song. And then people either side that meant nothing to, because it was just it captured that exact moment of impressionable sensibility being kind of slightly overwhelmed by the sort of enormity of this music.
Yes, as far as I can tell, my research is there are 2 or 3 different bands out there claiming to be the Rubettes today. So there's enough there to build some sort of career on the nostalgia circuit with it.
Well, I feel like we've really scaled the heights today, literally with Minster Court cascading up into the sky, and also with the Rubettes, Sugar Baby Love, which they'd feel very much an amazing partnership, even though they are excess of two different generations and two different sorts of sensibilities. They're still doing something kind of outrageous and sort of huge. They're a lovely companion to one another. So thank you very much for bringing those two things along today. Where can people follow you?
They can follow me on Instagram, where I post under my name, which is Philip.Downer. They can come on a tour with me at Sanborn House in Kensington or Highgate Cemetery, where I do tours. And I also do a 20th Century Society tour of, unsurprisingly, Surrey Docks. And we're running that again in March. So go to the 20th Century Society's website and make your bookings, folks.
I hope that walk is called, unsurprisingly, Surrey Docks, because that's a great title.
It certainly should be.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And now I'm off to hitchhike my way home. Thanks so much for listening. And remember that willfulness makes the world go round. Au revoir.